The mist rises slowly from the dark waters of the fjord, revealing the silhouette of a dragon-headed longship cutting through the morning haze. Dozens of oars move in perfect rhythm, each stroke propelling the vessel forward with unstoppable momentum. At the helm stands a figure gazing toward the horizon, where the unknown world awaits. This is not merely a journey across water. It is the beginning of one of history's most consequential migrations, a saga of conquest that would forever change the map of Europe. The year is 793 CE, and the North is stirring. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. The world of the 8th century was one of profound transition. The remnants of the Western Roman Empire had long since fragmented into a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities. Charlemagne's Frankish realm was consolidating power across continental Europe, while the British Isles remained divided among Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Celtic principalities, and Pictish territories. To the east, the Byzantine Empire maintained its tenuous hold on civilization's ancient heartlands, and the Islamic Caliphate expanded its influence across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. Mediterranean trade routes that had once connected the known world now functioned at a fraction of their former capacity, and urban centers throughout Western Europe had contracted, their grand Roman architecture standing as hollow reminders of a vanished imperial order. Yet far to the north, beyond the awareness of these established powers, communities of farmers, fishermen, and traders had been developing their own distinct culture for centuries. These Norse peoples inhabited the rugged coastlines and sheltered valleys of what we now know as Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, lands shaped by ice and sea where winters were long and unforgiving, and summer's brief abundance had to sustain life through the darker months. Here, in this challenging environment, the Norse developed a society built on kinship, honor, and resilience. Life in these northern realms followed the rhythm of seasons and tides. Small communities clustered around fertile valleys or protected harbors, rarely numbering more than a few hundred souls. Each settlement functioned almost as a world unto itself, connected to others by sea routes and occasional gatherings, but largely self-sufficient in day-to-day needs. Families lived in longhouses, sturdy wooden structures with thatched roofs that sheltered both people and livestock through the harsh winters. The center of each home featured a long hearth where fires burned almost continuously, not only providing warmth and light, but serving as gathering places where stories were shared and traditions passed from one generation to the next. These homes reflected the practical ingenuity of Norse culture. The steep pitched roofs shed heavy snow. Small, high windows minimized heat loss, while allowing smoke to escape and limited light to enter. Walls of timber, sometimes packed with insulating materials, kept the bitter cold at bay. Within these practical structures, Norse craftspeople created objects of remarkable beauty, intricately carved wooden items, fine textiles woven on upright looms, and metalwork that combined functional durability with aesthetic sophistication. Even everyday objects bore decorative elements, spirals, and interlacing patterns that would later find their fullest expression in the ornate stone crosses and illuminated manuscripts of the Christianized Norse world. The rhythm of daily life was governed by necessity and custom. Women managed the household, prepared food, made clothing, and often oversaw local trade, while men tended to fishing, hunting, and seasonal raiding. Both genders worked the limited agricultural land, growing barley, rye, and oats in the short growing season, and raising sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. Children began contributing to household labor from an early age, learning skills through observation and practice rather than formal education. In winter, when farming and fishing became limited, craftwork intensified. Boat repair, tool making, and the creation of the weapons that defined Norse martial culture. These practical activities were embedded in a rich cosmology. The Norse worldview was shaped by a tapestry of myths that explained the nature of existence. From the creation of the world from ice and fire to its eventual destruction at Ragnarok. Their gods were not distant, untouchable beings, but figures who faced challenges much like mortals did. Odin sacrificed his eye for wisdom and wandered the world in pursuit of knowledge. Thor defended both gods and humans against chaos with his mighty hammer. Freyr and Freya ensured fertility and abundance. Loki, the trickster, brought both trouble and innovation. These deities did not demand blind obedience, but respected courage, cleverness, and honor, values that would later fuel Norse expansion across the seas. The spirituality of the Norse was deeply practical, focused on navigating the uncertainties of life rather than promising salvation after death. Only those who died bravely in battle might be chosen by the Valkyries to join Odin in Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until called upon for the final battle at the end of days. For most, the afterlife meant a continued existence in the realm of hell, not a place of punishment, but simply the destination for those who died of old age or disease. This perspective fostered a culture that valued making one's mark in the present world, seeking fame and accomplishment that would live on in the memories and stories of those who remained. Religious practices centered around natural sites, sacred groves, distinctive rock formations, and bodies of water where offerings could be made to the gods and other spiritual beings. Archaeological excavations have revealed countless such offerings, from weapons and jewelry to animals, and occasionally humans, particularly in bog sites across Scandinavia. Later, as communities grew larger and more organized, more formal temple structures appeared, though these bore little resemblance to the grand stone edifices of southern Europe. Instead, they were wooden halls where communities gathered not only for religious ceremonies, but for feasts, assemblies, and the recitation of poetry and saga, activities that blended the spiritual and social dimensions of Norse life. The poetic tradition of the Norse was particularly significant, both as religious expression and cultural repository. Skalds, professional poets, occupied positions of prestige in the households of chieftains and kings, preserving and transmitting historical knowledge through complex verse forms. These poems employed intricate metaphorical systems called kennings, where the sea might become Aegir's realm, or a sword the ice of battle. The memorization and performance of these elaborate compositions served as a living archive of cultural knowledge in a society without widespread literacy, keeping alive the histories of lineages, the deeds of heroes, and the wisdom of ancestors. Social structure in the Norse world was less rigidly hierarchical than in many contemporary societies. While there were indeed kings, konungar, and jarls, earls, power was not absolute. Local assemblies called things allowed free men to have a voice in governance and legal matters. These gatherings, held at regular intervals in designated places, served multiple functions: resolving disputes, proclaiming laws, arranging marriages, and conducting religious ceremonies. The thing represented a form of participatory governance unusual for its time, though participation was limited to free men of a certain status, excluding thralls, slaves, and, to a lesser extent, women. Women, while limited in some respects by the conventions of the age, nevertheless enjoyed greater rights and autonomy than their counterparts in much of Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and in some circumstances even lead households or communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that women often managed trade and craft production, controlled household finances, and maintained religious practices. The keys dangling from women's belts in many burials symbolized not just domestic authority, but control over valuable resources stored in chests and storehouses. This relative flexibility would later prove an advantage as Norse settlers adapted to new lands and circumstances. The institution of slavery was an integral part of Norse society, as it was in most contemporary cultures. Thralls were captured in raids, purchased in markets, or born into bondage. Their labor underpinned the economic system, allowing free Norse to engage in more specialized activities, including the maritime ventures that would define the Viking Age. While some thralls might eventually earn their freedom, most remained in servitude throughout their lives, their status passing to their children. The prospect of capturing slaves for labor or sale was one of several motivations driving the Norse expansion that began in the late 8th century. But perhaps the most remarkable innovation of Norse culture, the one that would enable their astonishing expansion, was their mastery of shipbuilding and navigation. The longship represents one of the most perfectly adapted technologies in human history, a vessel precisely suited to its purpose and environment. Shallow drafted to navigate rivers and coastal waters, yet stable enough to cross open seas. Light enough to be portaged when necessary, yet strong enough to withstand Atlantic storms. Powered by both sail and oar to harness or overcome any wind condition. With these vessels, the Norse gained unprecedented mobility, transforming the very seas that had once isolated them into highways of conquest and commerce. The construction of these ships represented the pinnacle of Norse craftsmanship. Shipwrights worked without formal plans, relying on traditional knowledge passed through generations. They selected oak trees with natural curves for the keel and ribs, and split rather than sawed planks to preserve the wood's natural strength. The distinctive clinker-built design, with overlapping planks secured by iron rivets, created hulls that were both light and flexible, able to flex with the waves rather than fight against them. Decorated prows, often carved as dragon heads or other creatures, served not only as expressions of artistry, but as spiritual protection for the vessel and its crew. These ships were not the product of sudden innovation, but of centuries of incremental improvement. Archaeological discoveries like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, preserved in burial mounds and recovered in the 19th and early 20th centuries, reveal vessels of astonishing sophistication. The Oseberg ship, dated to around 820 CE, demonstrates not only technical mastery, but artistic refinement, with its elaborately carved prow and stern posts. The slightly later Gokstad ship represents a more practical seagoing design, capable of carrying a crew of 35 men across the open ocean. Together, these archaeological treasures provide tangible evidence of the maritime technology that enabled Norse expansion. Equally important were the navigational skills developed by generations of Norse seafarers. Without compasses or detailed charts, they relied on intimate knowledge of coastal features, the behavior of birds and marine life, the patterns of stars and sun, and the colors and movements of the sea itself. They developed sophisticated methods for determining latitude by measuring the height of the sun or the North Star above the horizon. They created mental maps of wind and current patterns and recognized the significance of cloud formations and the flight paths of birds in locating land. These accumulated techniques, passed from master to apprentice through practical experience rather than written instruction, enabled voyages of unprecedented ambition and range. Yet, for all their mastery of seafaring, the question remains: what drove these northern peoples to venture beyond their homelands in the late 8th century? The answer lies in a complex interplay of factors. Population pressure in the limited arable lands of Scandinavia created competition for resources. Norse inheritance customs, which favored the eldest son, left younger sons seeking fortunes elsewhere. Climate fluctuations may have reduced agricultural yields, forcing communities to look outward for sustenance. The development of the sailing longship itself opened new possibilities for travel and trade, creating opportunities that ambitious individuals were quick to exploit. Political changes also played a role. In Norway, King Harald Fairhair's efforts to consolidate power in the late 9th century drove some chieftains and their followers to seek independence elsewhere, particularly in Iceland. In Denmark, competition for control between rival kings pushed some ambitious leaders to build their power bases abroad. In Sweden, complex succession disputes similarly encouraged some contenders to seek fame and followers in foreign lands. Meanwhile, growing awareness of the wealth of European monastic centers and divided kingdoms presented tempting opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The first recorded Norse raid on foreign shores came in 793 CE, when warriors descended on the holy island of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with horror how heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The Irish Annals of Ulster similarly note that the sea spewed forth floods of foreigners over Erin, so that no haven, no landing place, no stronghold, no fort, no castle might be found, but it was submerged by waves of Vikings. These contemporary accounts, while certainly biased against the pagan invaders, nevertheless capture the shock and terror inspired by these unexpected attacks from the sea. The raid on Lindisfarne shocked Christian Europe not merely for its violence, but for its transgression of what had been considered sacred space. The monastery, founded in the 7th century by the Irish monk Aidan, had become a renowned center of learning and spirituality, home to illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Its isolation on a tidal island had seemed to offer protection, symbolizing the separation of monastic communities from worldly concerns. The Norse attack on this peaceful religious community announced the arrival of a new power that operated outside the established norms of European society, a people who saw opportunity where others saw sanctuary. In the decades that followed, Norse expeditions ventured further, probing the coastlines of the British Isles, Ireland, and Frankish territories. These early raids followed a pattern: swift attacks targeting wealthy, poorly defended sites, followed by equally swift retreats before local forces could mobilize. Monasteries were particularly vulnerable, not only because of their wealth in precious metals and manuscripts, but because they typically lacked substantial defenses. From the perspective of the Norse raiders, these were simply rational targets, concentrations of portable wealth with minimal risk. From the perspective of Christian chroniclers, they were sacrilegious atrocities that heralded the apocalypse. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their material consequences. The speed and unpredictability of Norse attacks created pervasive fear in coastal communities. The raiders seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with terrifying efficiency, and vanish before effective resistance could be organized. Prayers were added to church litanies, specifically asking for protection from the fury of the Northmen. This fear became a powerful weapon in itself, often prompting communities to offer tribute or ransom without resistance when Norse ships appeared on the horizon. As the frequency and scale of these expeditions increased, their nature began to evolve. What had begun as seasonal raiding gradually transformed into something more permanent. By the mid-9th century, Norse forces were establishing winter camps in foreign territories, allowing them to extend their operations and develop more sophisticated strategies. The Great Heathen Army that landed in East Anglia in 865 represented a new phase of Norse activity, a large, coordinated military force with political ambitions beyond mere plunder. The exact size and composition of this army remain subjects of historical debate. Contemporary chronicles, prone to exaggeration, describe vast hordes of pagan warriors. Modern archaeological evidence, including a mass grave discovered at Repton in Derbyshire, suggests a force numbering in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands, still a formidable military presence by the standards of the time. The army appears to have combined warriors from Denmark, Norway, and possibly Sweden, led by commanders claiming descent from legendary figures like Ragnar Lothbrok. Among these leaders were Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, names that would be recorded with dread in Anglo-Saxon chronicles. Over the next decade, this army campaigned across England, defeating 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, and establishing direct Norse control over large territories. Their military success stemmed from several factors: superior mobility, due to their use of ships to rapidly reposition forces; tactical flexibility that combined infantry, cavalry, and naval power; and, perhaps most importantly, a willingness to operate throughout the year rather than just in the traditional campaign season. While Anglo-Saxon forces typically disbanded after summer campaigns to allow warriors to return to agricultural duties, the Norse army remained in the field, pressing their advantage through the winter months. Only the Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred the Great successfully resisted, eventually forcing a treaty that established the Danelaw, a region of England under Norse law and administration that encompassed roughly the northeastern third of the country. Alfred's success resulted from his own military innovations, including the creation of a network of fortified towns, burhs, the development of a standing army, and the construction of improved warships to counter Norse naval superiority. The Treaty of Wedmore in 878 recognized the reality of Norse control over much of England while preserving Anglo-Saxon independence in the southwest. Within the Danelaw, Norse settlers established farms and towns, intermarried with local populations, and developed a distinctive Anglo-Norse culture that would leave lasting impressions on English language, law, and society. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Thwaitemark areas of Norse settlement, while everyday English words like sky, egg, law, husband, and window derive from Old Norse. Legal concepts like the jury system have roots in Norse traditions, as does the administrative division of counties into smaller units. Wapentakes in the Danelaw corresponding to hundreds elsewhere. The legacy of this settlement remains visible not only in place names and vocabulary, but in genetic studies that show significant Scandinavian DNA in populations from eastern and northern England. A similar pattern unfolded in Ireland, where initial raids gave way to the establishment of coastal settlements that evolved into trading centers like Dublin, Wexford, and Limerick. While Norse political control in Ireland remained largely limited to these coastal enclaves, their impact on trade networks and urbanization was profound. Before the Norse arrival, Ireland had few true urban centers. The Norse established fortified trading posts at key coastal locations, often at the mouths of rivers, creating the nuclei of what would become Ireland's major cities. These Norse-founded ports connected Ireland to wider commercial systems spanning from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, bringing new goods, ideas, and influences to the island. Dublin, originally established as a long fort ship base, around 841 CE, grew into the preeminent Norse settlement in Ireland and one of the largest slave markets in northwestern Europe. Archaeological excavations in the Woodkey area of modern Dublin have revealed the physical layout of this early settlement, with its distinctive Norse house types, evidence of specialized craft activities, and imported goods from across the known world. The economic vitality of Norse Dublin created a power base for ambitious leaders like Olaf Guthfrithson and Sihtric Silkbeard, who projected influence far beyond the settlement itself, and occasionally claimed the High Kingship of Ireland, though such claims were fiercely contested by native Irish rulers. The relationship between Norse settlers and native Irish was complex and fluid. Periods of conflict alternated with alliances, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. By the late 10th century, many Norse in Ireland had adopted Christianity and formed political and familial ties with Irish dynasties. Archaeological and genetic evidence indicates substantial intermarriage between the two communities, creating a hybrid Norse-Gaelic culture particularly evident in coastal regions and urban centers. This cultural fusion produced distinctive artistic styles visible in metalwork and stone carving, and syncretic religious expressions embodied in crosses that combined Christian imagery with traditional Norse motifs. In Scotland, Norse settlement concentrated in the northern and western Isles, Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, and parts of the mainland coast. In Orkney, Norse jarls established a powerful earldom that would last for centuries, controlling not only the islands but portions of northern Scotland and maintaining connections to Norway. These jarls, notably from the line founded by Rognvald Eysteinsson and his brother Sigurd the Mighty, balanced fealty to Norwegian kings with substantial local autonomy. The Orkneyinga saga, composed in Iceland in the 12th century, chronicles the complex history of this Norse colony, its internal power struggles, and its interactions with Scotland, Ireland, and Norway. The Isle of Man in the Irish Sea became another significant center of Norse-Celtic cultural fusion. Stone crosses erected on the island in the 10th and 11th centuries display a remarkable synthesis of artistic traditions with Christian imagery, alongside scenes from Norse mythology rendered in distinctive artistic styles. The Manx legal system and form of government centered on the Tynwald, an assembly that continues to function today as the island's parliament, has direct roots in Norse administrative practices. Even the three-legged symbol, Triskelion, on the Manx flag, may have origins in Norse solar symbols, though adapted to become a uniquely Manx emblem. In the east, Swedish Norse known as the Rus ventured down the river systems of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, establishing trading posts and principalities along key waterways. Their journey from the Baltic to the Black Sea required incredible navigation skills and adaptability. They navigated rapids, portaged their ships between river systems, and established relationships with local Slavic and Finnic peoples. The primary chronicle, a history of Kievan Rus compiled in the early 12th century, relates how the Slavs invited Rurik and his brothers to rule over them in Novgorod around 862 CE, though historians debate the accuracy of this account and the extent of Norse influence in early Rus development. What is clear is that by the late 9th century, Norse adventurers and merchants were establishing control over the key trade routes connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire and Islamic world. Archaeological evidence from sites like Staria Ladoga shows Norse presence from the mid-8th century, predating the events described in the primary chronicle. Excavations at Gnezdovo near Smolensk have revealed a substantial trading center with strong Norse cultural elements, strategically positioned along the portage routes between the Dvina, Dnieper, and Volga River systems. Similar sites at Shestovica, near Chernihiv and Iskorostan, demonstrate the extent of Norse influence along these vital commercial arteries. The Principality of Kyiv, founded by Rurik's successor, Oleg, around 882 CE, would eventually grow into the powerful state of Kievan Rus, a precursor to modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Under rulers like Oleg Igor and Sviatoslav, Kievan Rus expanded its territory and conducted ambitious military campaigns, including attacks on Constantinople in 907 and 941 CE. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, described in detail the annual trading expeditions of the Rus down the Dnieper to the Black Sea in his work De Administrando Imperio, providing valuable insights into the commercial operations that underpinned Norse Slavic prosperity. The cultural impact of these Norse adventurers on Eastern Europe was significant, but took different forms than in the West. Rather than establishing distinct settlements with Norse legal and linguistic traditions, the Rus rapidly integrated with local Slavic populations, adopting Slavic language and customs while maintaining trade connections to Scandinavia. By the time of Vladimir the Great, who ruled from 980 to 1015 CE and converted to Orthodox Christianity, Kievan Rus had evolved into a predominantly Slavic state, though still ruled by a dynasty of Norse origin. The Norse contribution remained visible in military organization, commercial practices, and certain aristocratic traditions, but became increasingly diluted over time as the ruling elite assimilated into Slavic culture. Yet the most remarkable example of Norse conquest and adaptation unfolded in what would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen in northern France. By the early 10th century, the Frankish kingdom was struggling with internal divisions and external pressures. Norse raiders had been targeting the Seine Valley for decades, sailing upriver to attack Paris and other settlements. In 911, King Charles the Simple of West Francia made a pivotal decision. Rather than continuing a costly and ineffective resistance, he granted territory around the lower Seine to a Norse leader named Rollo, who in exchange agreed to convert to Christianity and defend the region against further raiders. This transaction, formalized at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, represented a radical solution to a persistent problem. By transforming a Norse warlord into a Christian duke with territorial responsibilities, Charles hoped to create a buffer against further attacks and bring a troublesome adversary into the Frankish political system. For Rollo, it offered legitimacy, land, and the opportunity to transform seasonal plunder into permanent power. The agreement required significant compromises on both sides. Rollo accepted baptism and pledged fealty to Charles, though chronicles record his reluctance to perform the traditional act of homage, kissing the king's foot, delegating this humbling gesture to one of his warriors who, rather than bending to kiss the foot, lifted the king's foot to his mouth, toppling the monarch in an act that symbolized the uneasy nature of this new relationship. This pragmatic arrangement transformed a band of raiders into territorial rulers. Within a few generations, the descendants of these Norse settlers had created one of the most dynamic and sophisticated political entities in Europe. They adopted the French language, embraced Christianity, and developed administrative systems that blended Norse traditions with Frankish practices. Yet they retained the Norse aptitude for bold action and strategic thinking. The cultural transformation was remarkably swift. By the time of Rollo's grandson, Richard I, 942–996 CE, the ducal court at Rouen had become a center of Norman French culture, patronizing monastic foundations and literary production while maintaining effective military control over an increasingly coherent territory. The speed of this assimilation raises intriguing questions about Norse adaptability and the composition of the original settlement. While military leaders like Rollo were certainly Norse, the number of actual Norse settlers in Normandy was relatively small compared to the existing Gallo-Frankish population. Intermarriage was common from the beginning, with Rollo himself taking a Frankish wife, Papa of Bayeux, after setting aside his Norse wife. The Norman nobility that emerged from this fusion combined Norse military traditions with Frankish administrative practices and increasingly Christian religious patronage. They maintained connections to Scandinavia, offering refuge to Norse exiles like Olaf Tryggvason, later King of Norway, while positioning themselves as legitimate Christian rulers within the Frankish political sphere. By the early 11th century, Normandy had emerged as a formidable duchy whose ambitions would eventually extend far beyond its original territories. Under Duke Robert Thorir de Harz, 1027–1035 CE, and especially his illegitimate son, William, 1035–1087 CE, Norman influence expanded through strategic marriages, military campaigns, and ecclesiastical appointments. The Norman ducal house developed a reputation for effective governance, military innovation, and strategic acumen. They were particularly adept at legitimizing their rule through religious patronage, establishing and endowing monasteries and cathedrals across their territory while maintaining tight control over ecclesiastical appointments. This blending of piety and pragmatism would become a hallmark of Norman political culture. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, led by Duke William, himself a direct descendant of Rollo, represents in many ways the culmination of the Viking Age. Here were the descendants of Norse raiders returning to conquer the very island their ancestors had first targeted nearly 3 centuries earlier. The Battle of Hastings and its aftermath would transform English society, introducing a Norman-French aristocracy and fundamentally altering the trajectory of English language, law, and governance. The irony is profound. The Norse, who had once threatened European civilization, had, through their descendants, become its defenders and innovators. The success of William's conquest stemmed from the distinctive military capabilities developed in Normandy, combining Norse tactical flexibility with Frankish heavy cavalry and sophisticated castle-building techniques. The Norman knights who charged up Senlac Hill against Harold Godwinson's shield wall represented a military tradition far removed from their Norse ancestors' more infantry-focused approach. Yet some elements of Norse pragmatism remained visible in William's campaign: the strategic use of ships to transport his army, the rapid construction of prefabricated fortifications, and the ruthless efficiency with which he consolidated his victory through the infamous harrying of the North. The transformation of England under Norman rule was comprehensive. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely displaced, with Norman and Breton nobles installed in their place. A massive program of castle construction physically embodied the new order, with motte and bailey fortifications rapidly erected across the landscape. The church was reorganized under Norman leadership, with most English bishops replaced by Norman appointees, and an ambitious building program that would produce magnificent cathedrals in the Romanesque style. The Domesday Book of 1086, a comprehensive survey of the conquered kingdom, represented an unprecedented administrative achievement, documenting in meticulous detail the resources available to the new Norman state. Norman ambitions extended beyond England to Wales, Scotland, and perhaps most remarkably, southern Italy and Sicily. In the early 11th century, bands of Norman adventurers traveled to southern Italy, initially serving as mercenaries in the complex conflicts between Byzantine, Lombard, and Muslim forces. Under leaders like Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger, these Norman warriors gradually carved out territories for themselves, eventually creating the Kingdom of Sicily, which united the southern Italian mainland with the island of Sicily in a prosperous, multicultural state. Here, Norman rulers presided over a society that included Greek, Arab, and native Italian populations, fostering a remarkable cultural synthesis visible in monuments like the Cathedral of Monreale, which combines Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic artistic elements. By the late 11th century, Norman influence extended even to the eastern Mediterranean, with Norman participants playing significant roles in the First Crusade and establishing crusader states in the Levant. The Norman knight Tancred of Hauteville became Prince of Galilee and Regent of Antioch. Bohemond, son of Robert Guiscard, established himself as Prince of Antioch. These Norman crusaders brought with them the same combination of military effectiveness, administrative skill, and cultural adaptability that had served them well in Western Europe, establishing Latin Christian enclaves in the heart of the Islamic world. The Norman diaspora, spreading from Scandinavia to the eastern Mediterranean within the span of 3 centuries, represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural transmission and transformation. What began with pagan raiders from the northern fjords evolved into a sophisticated Christian political culture that would help shape medieval European civilization. The Normans became prolific builders, patrons of literature and learning, and innovative administrators, while retaining elements of the Norse boldness and pragmatism that had characterized their ancestors. Their trajectory demonstrates the complex processes by which outsiders can become insiders, transforming both themselves and the societies they enter. Yet, while these dramatic conquests and transformations were unfolding across Europe, it is crucial to remember that not all Norse people participated in this expansion. For every warrior who sailed away to raid or settle in foreign lands, many more remained in their Scandinavian homelands, continuing the traditional patterns of farming, fishing, and local trade. These communities underwent their own significant transformations during the Viking Age, though these changes were often more gradual and less documented than the dramatic conquests abroad. In Norway, the rugged topography of fjords and mountains had always encouraged local autonomy, with communities developing in relative isolation from one another. During the Viking Age, the process of state formation accelerated, particularly under Harold Fairhair, c. 872–932 CE, and his descendants, who gradually consolidated control over larger territories. According to later sagas, Harold's conquests were motivated by love. He had vowed not to cut his hair until he had unified Norway to win the hand of Gyda, daughter of a local king. Whatever the historical reality behind this romantic legend, Harold's campaigns against regional chieftains and petty kings marked a significant step toward Norwegian unification. Yet this was not a simple linear process. Power ebbed and flowed, with periods of centralization followed by fragmentation as rival claimants contested authority. After Harold's death, his numerous sons fought for control, with Eric Bloodaxe and Haakon the Good emerging as the most significant contenders. Haakon, raised in the Christian court of Athelstan of England, attempted to introduce Christianity to Norway, but faced significant resistance from traditionalist elements. The saga accounts of these struggles reveal the complex interplay of personal ambition, regional loyalty, and religious conviction that characterized Norwegian politics during this period. The sagas tell us of these struggles, documenting not only the grand adventures abroad, but the equally consequential political maneuvering at home. Egil's saga, for instance, describes how the poet-warrior Egil Skallagrimsson fiercely resisted King Eric Bloodaxe's attempts to extend royal authority, eventually forcing Egil to seek refuge in Iceland. Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson's history of the Norwegian kings, relates how Olaf Tryggvason and later Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, fought to establish both political unity and Christian faith against stubborn regional resistance. These narratives, while embellished for dramatic effect, nevertheless capture the tensions between traditional independence and emerging centralized power that characterized Norse society during this period. Religious transformation also reshaped the homelands, though at a different pace than in the conquered territories. Christianity arrived later in Scandinavia than in the lands the Norse had colonized. Norway's conversion began in earnest under Olaf Tryggvason at the end of the 10th century and continued under Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, in the early 11th century. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth claimed to have made the Danes Christian in the late 10th century, a declaration immortalized on the famous Jelling stone. Sweden's conversion was even more gradual, with pagan practices persisting in some regions well into the 12th century. The conversion process in Scandinavia differed significantly from the pattern in regions like England or Francia, where Christianity had deeper historical roots. Rather than a gradual diffusion through missionary activity, Scandinavian conversion was often driven by royal initiative, with kings using the new religion to enhance their authority and forge connections with Christian Europe. The famous Jelling Monument complex in Denmark embodies this political dimension of conversion. Here, Harald Bluetooth erected a massive rune stone declaring that he won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian, explicitly linking political unification with religious transformation. Nearby, a previous pagan burial mound was topped with a Christian church, physically symbolizing the religious transition under royal authority. This religious transition was rarely smooth. The sagas record instances of resistance and compromise as local communities negotiated the terms of their acceptance of the new faith. Some embraced Christianity willingly, seeing advantages in aligning with the dominant religious and political forces of Europe. Others resisted, viewing the new religion as a threat to traditional ways and power structures. Many likely practiced a syncretic blend of old and new beliefs for generations, nominally Christian, while maintaining aspects of pagan worldviews and practices. Archaeological evidence shows that pagan burial customs persisted alongside Christian ones in some regions, while Christian churches were sometimes built on or near previous pagan sacred sites, facilitating a gradual transition of religious allegiance. The adoption of Christianity brought Scandinavia more fully into the European cultural sphere, with profound implications for governance, law, education, and art. Monasteries and churches became centers of literacy and learning, introducing Latin culture and written record-keeping to societies that had previously relied on oral tradition. Kings increasingly legitimized their rule through Christian ideology, rather than traditional claims to divine ancestry. Legal codes were gradually reformed to align with Christian principles, modifying traditions around vengeance, kinship obligations, and dispute resolution. Yet, throughout this transformation, distinctive Norse cultural elements persisted, creating a unique Northern European Christian identity. This cultural synthesis is particularly visible in art and literature. Christian manuscript illumination in Scandinavia incorporated traditional Norse decorative motifs. Stone carvings on churches featured familiar interlace patterns and animal forms adapted to Christian narratives. Literary works like Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda preserved ancient mythological material within a Christian interpretive framework. Even as they embraced Christianity, Scandinavian societies maintained connections to their pagan past, integrating rather than simply replacing traditional cultural elements. Trade patterns also evolved significantly for those who remained in Scandinavia. The wealth generated through raiding, tribute, and settlement abroad flowed back to the homelands, stimulating economic development and urbanization. Trading centers like Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and Kaupang in Norway grew in size and complexity, connecting Scandinavian producers and consumers to wider commercial networks. These emporia functioned as gateways between the Baltic world and the broader European and Middle Eastern trading systems, handling goods ranging from Arabic silver coins to Byzantine silk, from Baltic amber to Rhenish wine. The archaeological remains of these trading centers reveal sophisticated urban communities with specialized craft quarters, harbor facilities, and defensive works. Excavations at Birka in Sweden have uncovered evidence of workshops producing jewelry, textiles, bone and antler items, and iron goods, alongside imported luxury items from as far away as Persia and North Africa. Similar findings at Hedeby show a planned settlement with a regular street grid, specialized production areas, and a substantial defensive wall. These were not merely marketplaces, but complex urban communities where people from diverse backgrounds lived and worked, creating cosmopolitan enclaves within the largely rural Scandinavian landscape. The commerce flowing through these centers transformed the economies of the Scandinavian homelands. Craftspeople specialized in producing goods for both local and distant markets, from fine metalwork to standardized trade goods. Merchants invested in increasingly sophisticated trading ventures, forming partnerships and developing credit arrangements to finance long-distance commerce. Agricultural producers intensified their output to supply urban markets, introducing new crops and farming techniques. Even as some Norse were conquering territories abroad, others were building commercial empires through peaceful exchange, integrating Scandinavia into global trading networks that stretched from the North Atlantic to Central Asia. Archaeological evidence reveals the material consequences of these changes. Excavations at urban sites show increasing specialization in craft production, more diverse imported goods, and growing social stratification. Rural sites reveal changes in agricultural practices, settlement patterns, and household organization. Burial customs reflect both the transition to Christianity and evolving social hierarchies. The graves of wealthy merchants and landowners from the late Viking Age contain diverse goods from distant lands, testifying to the cosmopolitan connections of the Scandinavian elite. Through these material remains, we can trace the transformation of Norse society even among those who never left their homelands. The Icelandic sagas, written down primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, but preserving older oral traditions, offer our most detailed window into the Norse world. These remarkable literary works describe not only the dramatic raids and conquests that have captured popular imagination, but the complex social, legal, and personal dimensions of Norse life. They reveal a society preoccupied with honor, reputation, and the intricacies of human relationships, concerns that shaped behavior both at home and abroad. Iceland itself represents a distinctive chapter in the Norse story, a colony established not through conquest, but through settlement, primarily by Norwegians seeking to escape Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power. Beginning around 870 CE, these settlers created a unique society without a king, organized around regional assemblies, things, and a national assembly, Althing, established in 930 CE. This Commonwealth period would last until the 13th century, when Iceland finally came under Norwegian royal control. The absence of a traditional monarchy created space for a distinctive political culture based on negotiation between powerful farming families, with law speakers and godar, chieftains who combined political and religious leadership, mediating conflicts and building alliances. The sagas that emerged from this distinctive society provide our richest literary source for understanding Norse culture. Njal's saga, for instance, details the workings of the Icelandic legal system and the tragic consequences when legal remedies fail to resolve deep-seated conflicts. It portrays a society where honor and legal process exist in uneasy tension, where formal procedures can be manipulated by the powerful, and where the absence of executive authority makes enforcement of judgments problematic. The saga's meticulous attention to legal detail offers insights into both procedural aspects of Norse law and the cultural values that underpinned the legal system. Laxdæla Saga explores the emotional and psychological dimensions of love, jealousy, and vengeance through the tragic love triangle of Kjartan, Bolli, and Gudrun. It portrays women as complex actors with their own ambitions and agency, capable of shaping events through both direct action and subtle influence. The saga's treatment of Gudrun, beautiful, intelligent, and ultimately destructive, reveals both the possibilities and limitations of female power in Norse society, where women could influence, but rarely directly control, political outcomes. The saga's attention to emotional interiority and psychological motivation distinguishes it from more action-oriented narratives, offering a window into the subjective experience of Norse life. Egil's saga portrays the tensions between poetic sensitivity and violent action in its complex protagonist. Egil Skallagrimsson embodies the Norse ideal of the warrior poet, equally skilled with sword and verse. Yet he also suffers from what modern readers might recognize as depression, experiencing profound emotional lows that contrast with his ferocious energy in battle and flighting poetic contests. Through Egil's story, we glimpse the emotional range of Norse experience, from the exhilaration of successful raids and poetic inspiration to the despondency of loss and exile. The saga portrays poetry not merely as entertainment, but as a way of processing emotion, preserving memory, and negotiating political relationships. These narratives, while certainly not unbiased historical documents, nevertheless preserve aspects of Norse worldviews and values that might otherwise be lost to us. They were composed in a Christian context but often depict pre-Christian events and attitudes, creating a literary bridge between pagan past and Christian present. They balance realistic detail with mythic elements, historical events with literary invention. Reading them requires careful interpretation, distinguishing historical core from narrative elaboration, yet they remain our most vivid portal into the mentality of the Norse world. By the mid-11th century, the age of Norse expansion was drawing to a close. In England, the failed invasion attempt by Harald Hardrada of Norway in 1066, just weeks before William of Normandy's successful conquest, symbolically marked the end of direct Norse military ambitions in Western Europe. Harald, who had served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard and ruled Norway with ambition and skill, represented the last great figure of traditional Viking enterprise. His defeat and death at Stamford Bridge against Harold Godwinson's forces closed a chapter in Norse history, even as the Norman conquest opened a new one with different actors and dynamics. In the East, Kievan Rus was evolving into a distinctly Slavic state, though still ruled by a dynasty of Norse origin. The conversion to Orthodox Christianity under Vladimir in 988 CE had accelerated the cultural assimilation of the Norse elite into Slavic society. While commercial connections to Scandinavia continued, the political orientation of Kievan Rus increasingly focused on Byzantine models and relationships. The magnificent Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, completed around 1037 CE under Yaroslav the Wise, symbolized this new orientation, a Byzantine-inspired structure commissioned by a ruler whose name, Yaroslav, remained Norse in origin, but whose cultural and religious outlook had become thoroughly Slavic and Orthodox. The Norse colonies in the North Atlantic, Iceland, Greenland, and briefly Vinland, North America, followed their own trajectories, with Iceland developing its unique republican governance system and literary culture. The Icelandic Commonwealth persisted until the 13th century, when internal conflicts and Norwegian pressure finally led to submission to the Norwegian crown in 1262-1264 CE. During this independent period, Iceland developed not only its distinctive political institutions, but a remarkable literary culture that would preserve and transmit the saga tradition. The Althing, established at Thingvellir in 930 CE, stands as one of the world's oldest parliamentary institutions, embodying the Norse tradition of assembly governance in its most developed form. Greenland, colonized from Iceland around 985 CE under the leadership of Eric the Red, established two main settlements that would persist for nearly 500 years. The eastern settlement, actually in the southern part of Greenland, and the smaller western settlement, further north along the coast, supported a population that may have reached 2,500 to 5,000 at its peak. These colonists adapted Norse farming practices to the challenging Arctic environment, raising livestock, hunting seals and caribou, and trading walrus ivory and polar bear hides for European goods. They built churches, maintained European cultural practices, and sustained contact with Iceland and Norway, though at increasingly irregular intervals as time passed. The Greenland settlements eventually disappeared in the 15th century, the western settlement around 1350 CE, and the eastern settlement by about 1450 CE. The reasons for this disappearance remain debated, likely involving a combination of climate change, as the medieval warm period gave way to the Little Ice Age, economic marginalization, as European demand for walrus ivory declined, increasing isolation as shipping to Greenland became less frequent, possible conflicts with Inuit peoples, and perhaps ecological damage from unsustainable farming practices. The abandoned ruins of these settlements, stone churches, longhouses, and barns, stand as poignant reminders of this ultimately unsuccessful attempt to transplant Norse culture to the edge of the habitable world. The brief Norse presence in North America, described in the Vinland sagas, Greenlander's Saga and Eric the Red's Saga, represents the furthest extent of Norse exploration. Archaeological evidence at L'Anseau Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in 1960, confirmed the saga accounts of at least temporary settlement in North America around 1000 CE. The site shows typical Norse construction techniques and artifacts, including a small smithy where iron was worked. This settlement appears to have been short-lived, likely serving as a base camp for further exploration rather than a permanent colony. The reasons for its abandonment likely included the small number of settlers, the vast distance from other Norse settlements, and conflicts with indigenous peoples whom the Norse called Skraelings. In Scandinavia itself, the emergence of stronger Christianized monarchies gradually transformed the political landscape. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden evolved from loose confederations of regions into more centralized kingdoms, integrated into European diplomatic, religious, and commercial systems. The maritime skills that had once enabled raid and conquest were increasingly channeled into trade. The descendants of those who had stayed behind now engaged with Europe through commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange rather than violence. Denmark emerged as the most politically coherent of the Scandinavian kingdoms during this period, particularly under the reign of Cnut the Great, 1016–1035 CE, who created a North Sea empire encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Though this imperial structure collapsed after Knut's death, it demonstrated the potential for Scandinavian political integration into the broader European system. Under the Valdemar dynasty in the 12th and 13th centuries, Denmark consolidated its position as a significant European power, expanding its influence in the Baltic and developing institutions of royal governance that would endure for centuries. Norway's political development was marked by persistent tensions between regional autonomy and royal authority, complicated by the country's challenging geography. After periods of Danish domination, Norwegian independence was reasserted under kings like Olav Kyrre in 1067–1093 CE, who promoted peaceful development and church building after the turbulent reign of his father, Harald Hardrada. The 13th century saw the height of medieval Norwegian power under Haakon IV, 1217–1263 CE, and Magnus VI, 1263–1280 CE, who expanded royal authority, codified law, and controlled territories extending to Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. This era of independence would end with the unions of Kalmar, 1397 CE, and later with Denmark, but the foundations of Norwegian identity had been firmly established. Sweden followed a distinct path with the gradual integration of the core regions of Svealand and Götaland under the authority of kings based at Uppsala and later Stockholm. The conversion to Christianity proceeded more slowly than in Denmark and Norway, with pagan traditions persisting in some regions into the 12th century. The consolidation of royal power accelerated under the Folking dynasty, particularly Birger Jarl, regent 1248–1266 CE, and his son Magnus Ladulås, 1275–1290 CE, who strengthened central authority and established more regular administrative systems. Sweden would emerge as a significant Baltic power in later centuries, but during the immediate post-Viking period, its development was more internally focused than its Scandinavian neighbors. Across all these kingdoms, the adoption of Christianity brought profound institutional changes. Diocesan structures were established, connecting local churches to archbishoprics at Lund, Nidaros, Trondheim, and Uppsala, and through them to the wider Catholic Church. Monastic orders established houses across Scandinavia, bringing new agricultural techniques, educational practices, and artistic traditions. Cathedral schools provided education for clergy and, increasingly, administrative personnel for royal governments. Written law codes replaced or supplemented oral tradition, while royal chanceries began producing documents in Latin and eventually in vernacular languages. These institutional developments integrated Scandinavia more fully into European cultural and political systems. Yet the legacy of the Viking Age endured, both for those who conquered and those who remained. In the conquered territories, Norse genetic, linguistic, and cultural influences persist to this day. Place names across northern Europe, from Grimsby and Whitby in England to Normandy in France to Kyiv in Ukraine, testify to Norse settlement and influence. Legal concepts, artistic motifs, and linguistic elements were absorbed into the cultures the Norse encountered, creating distinctive hybrid traditions. In York, once the center of the Danelaw, modern excavations at Jorvik have revealed a thriving 10th century city, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions blended in daily life, from food preparation to craft production to religious practice. For those who never left Scandinavia, the Viking Age represented a crucial transition from peripheral isolation to European integration. The wealth, ideas, and connections generated during this period laid foundations for the development of the Scandinavian kingdoms and their subsequent roles in European history. The tensions between traditional autonomy and emerging state power, between pagan traditions and Christian institutions, between local identity and wider connections, would continue to shape Scandinavian society long after the raids had ended. The distinctive Nordic political cultures that would eventually produce the modern welfare states of Scandinavia have roots in this formative period, when Norse societies negotiated their entry into the European mainstream while preserving elements of their particular traditions. The Norse story reminds us that history is rarely simple. The same people who brought terror to monastery shores also created sophisticated legal systems, exquisite poetry, and far-reaching trade networks. Those who remained behind underwent their own profound transformations, less dramatic perhaps, but no less consequential for the future of Northern Europe. Together, these parallel stories of conquest and continuity, of those who ventured forth and those who stayed behind, compose the complex legacy of the Viking Age. When we look back across the centuries to this formative period, what stands out most clearly is adaptability. Whether settling new lands or transforming their homelands, the Norse demonstrated remarkable capacity to engage with changing circumstances while maintaining elements of their distinctive cultural identity. Their journeys, both literal and metaphorical, remind us that human societies are never static, that cultural contact brings both conflict and creative synthesis, and that even seemingly peripheral regions can suddenly emerge as drivers of historical change. The legacy of the Norse who conquered and those who remained continues to shape our world in subtle ways. The English language we speak today bears the imprint of Norse words and grammatical influences. Legal systems across Northern Europe incorporate elements derived from Norse traditions. The political geography of regions from Britain to Ukraine still reflects patterns established during the Viking Age. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural memory of the Norse, preserved in saga and stone, in archaeology and art, continues to inspire imagination and inquiry, reminding us of the complex interplay between violence and creativity, tradition and innovation that characterizes human societies in periods of transformation. The mists that shrouded those first longships setting forth from their fjords have long since cleared, revealing the complex patterns of migration, conquest, settlement, and adaptation that followed. Yet something of the Norse spirit, that blend of pragmatism and poetry, of adventurousness and attachment to homeland, of fierce independence and community belonging, continues to resonate across the centuries, a distant echo of oars in rhythm against the endless sea.